Planet X, mystery heavenly body discovered, Washington Post article. For those of you who never read the article put out by the Washington Post back around the time that the IRAS, I-R-A-S, which stands for Infrared Astronomical Satellite, was put up to look for a large object or planet that had been perturbing all the planets, and because of the perturbations they figured that it had to be right about there in the sky, and so they built this infrared telescope, launched it on a satellite, and vada bing vada boom, there it is, the planet they were looking for. So if you have never read this article and don't know about its existence, I'm going to read it to you right now. This article will inform you about the truth. The truth is that we discovered Nibiru, or Planet X, or Wormwood, or the Destroyer back in 1983. And we couldn't see this planet or constellation or whatever it is because it doesn't emit light. It's hot and it emits infrared waves or heat waves. It just doesn't reflect enough sunlight to be seen from 50 billion miles away. The article, by the way, publishes the distance at 50 million miles, and they meant to say 50 billion miles. At the end of the article, they issue, a few days later, I think it was, they issued a correction. So when I read 50 million miles, you just think 50 billion miles, okay? So they published this story on the Washington Post and many other places. And then right away, they pulled the story. They hushed it up. This discovery was too disturbing to release to the slaves. They might abandon their mortgages and stop paying the IRS if they know that they're going to die soon. What about those enslaving credit cards with the 24% interest? You think people would stop making payments on those and spend the money instead if they knew they were going to die next month? I think that's the natural thing to do, and that's why this has to be quieted. So let's keep this a secret, okay? Tell everyone. The article reads, possibly as large as Jupiter, mystery heavenly body discovered. Now, we've learned a lot about Planet X since this article was written. We know now that it's not as large as Jupiter or Saturn. It's about 4 times the size of Earth if you measure diameter. But if you measure the mass, then it's 23 times the mass of Earth. According to the aliens who tell us the truth, I'm talking about the Zetas. The article was written by Thomas O'Toole, Washington Post staff writer, on Friday, December 30th, 1983, and it was on page A1. So that means it was pretty important news to be on A1. A heavenly body possibly as large as the giant planet Jupiter, and possibly so close to Earth that it would be part of this solar system, has been found in the direction of the constellation Orion by an orbiting telescope aboard the U.S. Infrared Astronomical Satellite. Now, I want you to know that even though it started out in the constellation of Orion, it moved around as it was coming in. It was perceived to be in the constellation of Gemini and then Taurus. I think it's now in Orion, but the reason that it changes apparent position is because it's moving and we're moving. We're going around the sun, and this thing is coming in. And so where it appears in the sky is going to change. Next paragraph. So mysterious is the object that astronomers do not know if it's a planet, a giant comet, a nearby protostar that never got hot enough to become a star, a distant galaxy so young that it is still in the process of forming its first stars, or a galaxy so shrouded in dust that none of the light cast by its stars ever gets through. Okay, so they're looking at something that's hot, and they don't know how far away it is. Yet later in the article, they say that it's 50 billion miles, which means it's in this solar system. Now, the distance from the Earth to the Sun is 93 million miles, and we call that 1 astronomical unit. Neptune is about 30 astronomical units out there. So it's 30 times 93 million, or about 3 billion, or is it 30 billion? Well, 93 million times 10 would be 930 million. And you multiply that by 3, and you get 2.7 billion. Okay, so Neptune is about 3 billion miles out there. And Pluto is 50 astronomical units, so it's 50 times 93 million. Let's round it off and say 100 million. 50 times 100 million. Something is wrong with the math here. 93 million. Let me do it on the calculator. Okay, so if you take the distance from the sun to the earth, that's 93 million miles, and we call that 1 astronomical unit. And Neptune is 30 astronomical units out. That's 2.79 billion miles out. And Pluto is 50 astronomical units out, and so that's 4.65 billion miles out. So 50 million miles out is wrong. 50 billion miles is wrong. That would be more than 10 times the distance that this object actually was. If this was in the Kuiper belt ranges from Neptune to Pluto. Like the asteroid belt, it's the Kuiper belt. It has 20 times the distance and 200 times the mass of the asteroid belt. It's just a lot of junk out there between Neptune and Pluto. And you're only talking about 3 to 5 billion miles from Neptune to Pluto, with Pluto being 5 billion miles out and Neptune being 3 billion, roughly. I'm using rough figures. 3 billion miles to Neptune, 5 billion miles to Pluto, and the Kuiper belt lies between the two. Now this object spends 1,800 years going out and then 1,800 years coming back, roughly. The actual average is 3657. The orbit is on an average of 3,657 years. So half of that, 1,823 and a half, 1,823.24 years it's going out, and 1,823 or 4 years it's coming back towards the sun. So where was it in 1983? It would have to be relatively close in order to arrive now. We are told that it takes, I'm talking about Stan Deyo said on an interview, that it spends 11 or 12 years coming around the sun in the close proximity of Earth. So for 11 or 12 years we have weird weather, volcanoes and earthquakes, and a pole shift. And depending on where the Earth is at the time that this thing arrives, and that's variable because there's a lot of junk out there in the Kuiper belt, and this thing is reacting with all of it. It's picking up things as it travels, and then when it comes in, it loses some of that junk when the stuff starts being pulled by other planets. It's like magnets. It goes out there and picks up all the junk, and then it brings it in and delivers it. If the Earth passes through the tail of this thing, we're going to get a hail of junk. It's like pieces of iron from a junkyard falling on the Earth. It's going to cause a lot of problems. And a lot of people will be killed by the falling junk. They'll be killed by the petrochemicals in the tail, because that tail is made up largely of methane gas and other hydrocarbons. And the aliens are telling us that's where our oil comes from. It falls down to the earth. Some of it burns. It burns up a lot of the oxygen in the air. Some things suffocate, and then they just fall over dead. And so being on the surface is not safe anywhere. Not completely safe. There are relatively safer places, but no place is absolutely safe. Okay, so we have Neptune at 30 astronomical units out, 2.79 billion miles. And we have Pluto at 50 astronomical units out, 4.65 billion miles. So if this object was only 50 million miles out, we have problems. Next paragraph. All I can tell you is that we don't know what it is, says Dr. Jerry Neugebauer, IRAS chief scientist for California's Jet Propulsion Laboratory and director of the Palomar Observatory for the California Institute of Technology, said in an interview. Okay, so they see this, they report it, and then they send out the reporters to interview Dr. Jerry Neugebauer. And at first he tells the truth. We don't know much about it. The most fascinating explanation of this mystery body, which is so cold it casts no light and has never been seen by optical telescopes on Earth or in space, is that it is a giant gaseous planet as large as Jupiter and as close to Earth as 50 trillion miles. Trillion miles! Now that's 1,000,000 times farther out than it actually is. 50 trillion miles. While that may seem like a great distance, in earthbound terms, it is a stone's throw in cosmological terms, so close in fact that it would be the nearest heavenly body to Earth beyond the outermost planet Pluto. Boy, is that guy off. Pluto, remember, is only 4.65 billion miles out, and he's talking 50 trillion? The difference between billion and trillion is 1,000 times the distance. Now you take the number 50, and that's 10 times more. So we're talking about 10,000 times farther out than it actually is. This guy should have been fired. What a mistake for a scientist to make. He doesn't know how far out Pluto and Neptune are? I'm aghast by this guy's testimony. If it is really that close, this is a quote, it would be part of our solar system, says Dr. James Houck of Cornell University's Center for Radiophysics and Space Research and a member of the IRAS science team. We have one clown who's saying that it's 50 trillion miles out, and another clown saying if it's really that close, that's 10,000 times farther out than it actually is. If we assume that it's out there beyond the Kuiper Belt at Pluto. And in order for this thing to be near us, if this is on a 3,600-year cycle, it's already gone all the way out and has come most of the way back. It couldn't be 4.65 billion miles out. And this quote of 50 trillion miles out has fooled all the scientists. Boy, I have no confidence in our science team. One guy's quoting 50 trillion miles, and Dr. James Houck of Cornell is saying if it's really that close, it would be a part of our solar system. And then he says if it's that close, I don't know how the world's planetary scientists would even begin to classify it. I have no confidence in any of these guys. I wouldn't trust their classification. They call it a gas giant. It may have an atmosphere of methane and other hydrocarbons, but I would not consider it a gas giant. It is a very dense iron ball with an atmosphere of methane. The mystery body was seen twice by the infrared satellite as it scanned the northern sky from last January to November, when the satellite ran out of the super-cold helium that allowed its telescope to see the coldest bodies in the heaven. The second observation took place 6 months after the first, and suggested the mystery body had not moved from its spot in the sky near the western edge of the constellation Orion in that time. Well, I disagree completely with this because I don't think it was in the western edge of the constellation Orion. It was in the southeastern corner of Orion. It moved west, it moved north, and it moved into Gemini, the southeast corner of Gemini. And then it came around, crossing over, going east across Orion and into Taurus. Taurus is to the right of Orion. And then it dropped down. Now this object was not moving east and west and dropping down. What it was is we were perceiving it because we were going around the sun. And this thing is coming in. And that's why it appears to be moving east and west and up and down. Now there's another quote here by Hauck, and he says, the fact that it has not moved from its spot on the western edge of the constellation Orion, this suggests that it's not a comet, because a comet would not be as large as the one we've observed, and a comet would probably have moved. Hauck said, a planet may have moved if it were as close as 50 trillion miles, but it could still be a more distant planet and not have moved in 6 months' time. Well, if it's coming in, it's almost like watching a bullet that's coming at you. If it's coming in, it doesn't appear to be moving, but it's moving. It's moving so fast it's going to tear your brains out when it reaches your head. I just can't get over the fact that he's using a number of 50 trillion when the real number is 5 billion, and that's 10,000 times farther out. And these guys are men of science? They act more like Bozo the Clown. Whatever it is, Hauck said, the mystery body is so cold, its temperature is no more than 40 degrees above absolute zero, which is 456 degrees Fahrenheit, below zero. Well, that's very, very, very cold. The telescope aboard IRAS is cooled so low and is so sensitive it can see objects in the heavens that are only 20 degrees above absolute zero. When IRAS scientists first saw the mystery body and calculated that it could be as close as 50 trillion miles, there was some speculation that it might be moving toward Earth. So the men of science had not observed all of the evidence of floods and whale bones at the tops of mountains and frozen carcasses of elephants in Siberia or mammoths in Siberia eating tropical grasses and a swamp underneath Antarctica, and they didn't put all this together and understand that something is coming around cyclically and that it's due again. And now we've got Neugebauer talking again. He says it's not incoming mail. So he's a clown relating this to mail. Well, it is incoming, and it's worse than mail. It's worse than a letter from the IRS. And then he says, it's not incoming, and I want to douse that idea with as much cold water as I can. All right, so he doesn't want anybody to believe that it's coming in. He's setting up a lie. Not only a lie, but he has bad science, and so do all the rest of them, 50 trillion miles. They can't tell the difference between 5 billion and 50 trillion. That's 10,000 times farther out. And these are the people we're depending on. So Neugebauer is saying it's not coming in. Oh, he's sure. And then the interviewer says, then what is it? What is it if it's as large as Jupiter and so close to the sun that it would be part of the solar system? Now, folks, our solar system goes out as far as Pluto, and they declassified Pluto. It's no longer a planet, it's a planetoid or something smaller than a planet. So Neptune is really the last planet, and that's at 2.79 billion miles out, 30 astronomical units out. They're measuring something that's 10,000 times farther out, 10,000 times farther than our farthest planet, and they're calling that this solar system? What is wrong with these guys? Conceivably, it could be the 10th planet astronomers have searched for in vain. All right, so they know that there's another planet out there because they see the perturbations of other planets. And because of those mathematical numbers, they can tell just about where it ought to be. They triangulate and they find that it has to be right about there. They look there with an infrared and they find it. Now, if they know where it's at, they certainly knew the distance from the Earth. And they couldn't have been off by a factor of 10,000. It reads, it also might be a Jupiter-like star that started out to become a star eons ago, but never got hot enough, like the sun, to become a star. Well, that's the first intelligent thing I've read here. While they cannot disprove that notion, Neugebauer and Hauck are so bedeviled by it that they do not want to accept it. Neugebauer and Hauck hope that the mystery body is a distant galaxy, either so young that its stars have not begun to shine, or so shrouded by dust that its starlight cannot penetrate the shroud. Well, you know, this really baffles me. These are men of science, and they know the perturbations, and they know approximately where this thing is, and they know how far out it is because of the perturbations. It would have to have a certain mass and be a certain distance, and that's all mathematical. You know right where it should be. They look for it, they find it, and now they're calling this thing a distant galaxy. This really shows how inept they are. These guys are the leaders. What are the followers saying and thinking? And then Neugebauer says, I believe it's one of these dark young galaxies that we've never been able to observe before. If it is, then it is a major step forward in our understanding of the size of the universe, how the universe formed, and how it continues to form as time goes on. The next step in pinpointing what the mystery body is, Neugebauer says, is to search for it with the world's largest optical telescopes. Already the 100-inch diameter telescope at Cerro del Tololo in Chile has begun its search, and the 200-inch telescope at Palomar Mountain in California has earmarked several nights next year to look for it. If the body is close enough and emits even a hint of light, the Palomar telescope should find it, since the infrared satellite has pinpointed its position. I don't think so. I don't think they pinpointed its position if they think it's 10,000 times as far out as it actually is. Okay, then on the bottom of this page it says item 123, December 31st, 1983, Saturday final edition. Item 127, the distance from Earth of a mysterious object in space was reported incorrectly in some editions yesterday. The correct figure is 50 billion miles. I don't think so. Not possible. That would be more than 10 times as far out as Pluto, and that's not correct. Thanks for watching. About its existence, I'm going to read it to you right now. This article will inform you about the truth. The truth is that we discovered Nibiru, or Planet X, or Wormwood, or the Destroyer back in 1983. And we couldn't see this planet or constellation or whatever it is because it doesn't emit light. It's hot and it emits infrared waves or heat waves. It just doesn't reflect enough sunlight to be seen from 50 billion miles away. The article, by the way, publishes the distance at 50 million miles, and they meant to say 50 billion miles at the end. Natural thing to do, and that's why this has to be quieted. So let's keep this a secret, okay? Tell everyone. The article reads, possibly as large as Jupiter, mystery heavenly body discovered. Now, we've learned a lot about Planet X since this article was written. We know now that it's not as large as Jupiter or Saturn. It's about 4 times the size of Earth if you measure diameter. But if you measure the mass, then it's 23 times the mass of Earth. According to the aliens who tell us the truth, I'm talking about the Zetas. The article was written by Thomas O'Toole, Washington Post staff writer. On Friday, December 3rd, of the article, they issue, a few days later, I think it was, they issued a correction. So when I read 50 million miles, you just think 50 billion miles, okay? So they published this story on the Washington Post and many other places. And then right away, they pulled the story. They hushed it up. This discovery was too disturbing to release to the slaves. They might abandon their mortgages and stop paying the IRS if they know that they're going to die soon. What about those enslaving credit cards with the 24% interest? You think people would stop making payments on those and spend the money instead if they knew they were going to die next month? I think that's the 30th, 1983, and it was on page A1. So that means it was pretty important news to be on A1. A heavenly body possibly as large as the giant planet Jupiter, and possibly so close to Earth that it would be part of this solar system, has been found in the direction of the constellation Orion by an orbiting telescope aboard the U.S. infrared astronomical satellite. Now, I want you to know that even though it started out in the constellation of Orion, it moved around as it was coming in. It was perceived to be in the constellation of Gemini and then Taurus. I think it's now in Orion, but Planet X, mystery heavenly body discovered, Washington Post article. For those of you who never read the article put out by the Washington Post back around the time that the IRAS, I-R-A-S, which stands for Infrared Astronomical Satellite, was put up to look for a large object or planet that had been perturbing all the planets, and because of the perturbations they figured that it had to be right about there in the sky, and so they built this infrared telescope, launched it on a satellite, and vada bing vada boom, there it is, the planet they were looking for. So if you have never read this article and don't know